The same people who crossed the street to avoid my son were suddenly screaming his name for help. The night the fire alarms echoed across Cedar Hill, I was sitting on my front porch wrapped in my late husband's old brown cardigan, watching the wind bend the oak trees across the street. The air smelled like rain and burned electricity, the kind of smell that settles into your chest before a storm arrives. Most of the houses on our block were dark except for the Whitmore's place at the very end of the cul-de-sac, where warm yellow lights spilled through oversized windows and music drifted into the night air. Linda Whitmore had insisted on hosting her neighborhood party anyway, even after the weather alerts warned everyone to stay home. That was Linda, the kind of woman who smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes. The kind who once called the police because my grandson's music was too aggressive, even though he had only been washing his father's truck in the driveway with the radio barely loud enough to hear from the sidewalk. I remember Marcus standing there calmly, while two officers questioned him under our porch light like he didn't belong in the neighborhood he'd lived in for 11 years. My son never raised his voice, never argued. He just answered politely, while Linda watched from behind her curtains with a satisfied little smile on her face. People in Cedar Hill liked to pretend they weren't cruel. They preferred softer words. Concerned, careful, traditional. But after enough years, you learn the difference between kindness and tolerance. Tolerance means people will wave at you in daylight and lock their car doors when you walk by at night. Marcus stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight and a toolbox. At 42, my son had his father's broad shoulders and patient eyes. "Storm's getting worse," he said quietly. "Power lines are already flickering near the west entrance." I nodded and looked toward the Whitmore's house, where laughter still floated through the wind. Expensive cars lined the curb. Men in golf jackets stood under patio heaters drinking bourbon, while women wrapped in beige sweaters smiled over wine glasses. Not one of those people had ever invited us into their homes. Not once. Even after Marcus repaired flooded basements during the winter freeze 2 years earlier. Even after Naomi volunteered at the church food drive every Thanksgiving. We were good enough to help, just never good enough to belong. Another gust of wind swept through the street hard enough to shake the porch swing beside me. Somewhere in the distance, a transformer popped with a sound like a gunshot. Then everything went dark. The entire street disappeared in a single breath. The music stopped first. Then came the screaming. I stood slowly as red emergency lights began flashing somewhere beyond the trees. Across the street, neighbors stumbled onto their lawns in confusion while smoke curled into the sky near the Whitmore's garage. Someone yelled Linda's name. Another voice shouted that a child was still inside the house. For one long second, nobody moved. The same people who spent years treating my son like a threat suddenly looked around desperately for the man they always avoided. Then Marcus set down his toolbox, grabbed the flashlight, and started running toward the fire. Marcus disappeared into the smoke before anyone could stop him. I remember hearing Linda Whitmore screaming from somewhere near the driveway. Her perfectly polished voice cracked open by panic for the first time in all the years I had known her. The flames near the garage were not large yet, but thick gray smoke rolled upward fast enough to swallow the front of the house. Neighbors crowded the sidewalks in slippers and rain jackets, holding phones in trembling hands while nobody seemed willing to move any closer. Cedar Hill had always been the kind of neighborhood where people preferred watching problems through windows instead of stepping into them. I pulled Naomi closer beside me as emergency sirens echoed faintly somewhere beyond the highway. My granddaughter was 16 now, tall and quiet like her father, with careful eyes that noticed everything even when she pretended not to. She stood frozen beside the mailbox, clutching my arm hard enough to hurt. "Dad went inside," she whispered, though we both already knew. Across the street, Mr. Holloway from the blue colonial house kept muttering that firefighters were coming. Mrs. Granger cried softly into her hands. Someone else kept saying there was a little girl trapped upstairs. It struck me then how strange fear makes people. Just 2 weeks earlier, those same neighbors had signed another complaint against Marcus because his work truck had been parked overnight in front of our own house. Linda claimed it made the street look commercial. Before that, they complained about Naomi practicing volleyball in the driveway because the sound was disruptive. Every year there was something new. A new reason to remind us we were tolerated, not welcomed. When we first moved into Cedar Hill 11 years ago, I truly believed things would be different. Marcus had just accepted a management position with the electric company after years of working double shifts to support Naomi alone. He bought our brick house at the end of Sycamore Lane because the schools were excellent and the streets looked safe enough for children to ride bicycles after dinner. I still remember unpacking boxes while neighbors slowed their cars to stare at us through rolled-up windows. Nobody introduced themselves that first week. Nobody brought cookies or welcome baskets the way they always did whenever another white family moved in. Linda Whitmore came closest. She walked across the street wearing white tennis shoes and a pale pink sweater set, smiling politely while her eyes scanned our moving truck. "We take pride in keeping this neighborhood orderly," she said instead of hello. At the time, Marcus simply smiled and thanked her for stopping by. My son had spent his whole life believing hard work and patience could soften people. For a while, he kept trying. He attended every homeowners association meeting. He shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways during winter storms. He fixed broken fences for free. But kindness in Cedar Hill often came with invisible conditions. They wanted his labor. They wanted his politeness. They just never wanted him too close. A loud cracking sound snapped me back to the present as sparks burst near the side of the Whitmore's roofline. Naomi gasped. Beside me. Then suddenly the front door opened and Marcus emerged through the smoke carrying a little blonde girl wrapped tightly in a gray blanket. The entire street fell silent. Linda Whitmore ran across the lawn so fast, she nearly slipped on the wet grass. Her mascara had streaked beneath her eyes, and her expensive beige coat hung crooked off one shoulder as she grabbed the little girl from Marcus with trembling hands. "Olivia," she kept repeating over and over, pressing the child tightly against her chest while the little girl cried into the blanket. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the wind, the distant sirens, and the crackling hum coming from somewhere near the garage. Marcus stepped back slowly, breathing hard, but keeping his voice calm as always. "There is still smoke near the kitchen," he told the crowd. "Everybody needs to stay back until the fire department gets here." It amazed me how quickly people listened to him now. Men who had spent years questioning whether my son belonged in Cedar Hill suddenly nodded at his instructions without hesitation. Mr. Holloway immediately started pulling people farther from the driveway. Mrs. Granger wrapped an arm around Naomi's shoulders and asked if she was all right in a voice so gentle it almost sounded unfamiliar. Naomi looked confused by the sudden kindness. "Honestly, so did I." Then Linda lifted her eyes toward Marcus. I had imagined that woman saying many things over the years. Sharp things, defensive things, maybe even embarrassed things, but never silence. She just stared at him standing there in the flashing red lights, rain soaking through his dark jacket, while smoke curled behind him into the night sky. There was something almost painful in her expression, as though she had finally been forced to look directly at a truth she had avoided for years. Marcus gave her a small nod and turned away before she could speak. That was my son. He never demanded apologies. He never stood around waiting for gratitude. He simply walked back toward me, and Naomi, like saving lives, was no different than helping somebody carry groceries. The fire trucks arrived less than 3 minutes later, though it felt much longer. Bright emergency lights painted the entire street red and blue, while firefighters hurried toward the Whitmore's house, carrying hoses and equipment. Neighbors gathered in clusters under umbrellas and porch overhangs, whispering quietly now instead of laughing the way they had only an hour earlier at Linda's party. I noticed something strange then. Nobody was avoiding us anymore. Nobody crossed the street when Marcus approached. Nobody lowered their voices when Naomi walked past. Fear had vanished from their faces, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. Shame. Naomi stood beside me watching the firefighters work while rainwater dripped from the edge of her hood. "Grandma," she asked softly, "why do people always wait until something bad happens to see somebody clearly?" I looked at my granddaughter carefully because 16-year-old girls are not supposed to sound that tired. She had learned too young how exhausting it is to prove your humanity over and over to people determined not to see it. I brushed damp curls away from her forehead and thought about all the years we spent shrinking ourselves to make others comfortable. The years Marcus lowered his voice during arguments. The years Naomi avoided wearing hoodies because store employees followed her through aisles. The years I smiled politely at neighbors who never once invited us to Thanksgiving dinners or 4th of July cookouts. Some people only recognize goodness after they need it. I said quietly. Naomi looked across the street toward Linda Whitmore, standing alone beneath the flashing lights with tears running silently down her face. Do you think she feels bad now? She whispered. I watched Linda carefully for a long moment before answering. I think tonight was the first time she realized we were never the danger. The storm finally passed sometime after midnight, leaving Cedar Hill soaked and strangely quiet beneath the blinking glow of utility trucks and emergency lights. By morning, the neighborhood looked different to me. Not damaged exactly. Exposed. Wet leaves covered the sidewalks in dark clumps, and several trees had snapped along the main road leading into the subdivision. The Whitmore's garage stood blackened near the roofline, while restoration vans crowded their driveway. Marcus had barely slept 3 hours before leaving again to help the electric crews restore power across town. That was another thing about my son. He never stopped showing up for people, even when they gave him every reason not to. Naomi sat at the kitchen table scrolling silently through her phone while I made coffee. The smell filled the house slowly, warm and familiar, but the tension in the room lingered from the night before. Finally, she looked up at me. Everybody is talking about Dad online. I frowned slightly. Naomi turned the phone toward me, and there he was on the screen, running through smoke, carrying little Olivia Whitmore wrapped in that gray blanket. Somebody across the street had recorded nearly everything from their porch. The video had already spread through local community pages overnight. Thousands of comments filled the screen beneath it. Hero, brave man, incredible neighbor. Some people even admitted they had judged him unfairly for years. I stared at the words longer than I should have, because part of me did not know what to do with them. Praise can feel strange when it arrives from people who once made you feel invisible. Naomi kept scrolling quietly. Then her expression changed. Grandma, she said carefully, look at this. It was an older post from the Cedar Hill neighborhood forum. Somebody had reposted screenshots from previous years. Complaints about Marcus parking his work truck overnight. Complaints about loud music. Complaints about suspicious activity near our property. Nearly every post came from the same account. Linda Whitmore, 74. Naomi swallowed hard. She really did all of it. I sat down slowly at the table. Deep down, I think we had always known. But there is something painful about seeing cruelty written out plainly in black and white, especially when it comes from someone who spent years smiling at church bake sales and waving from manicured lawns. One post stopped me cold. Certain families simply do not fit the character of Cedar Hill. The timestamp showed it had been written almost 6 years earlier, only months after we moved in. I felt suddenly tired in a way sleep could not fix. Naomi stared at the screen with glassy eyes. I spent years thinking maybe I was imagining it, she whispered. At school, at stores, even here. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. No, sweetheart, I said softly. You were never imagining it. There was a knock at the front door just before noon. Naomi looked nervous immediately. For years, unexpected knocks usually meant another complaint, another uncomfortable conversation, another reminder that we did not quite belong. But when I opened the door, Linda Whitmore stood there alone holding a covered casserole dish with both hands. Her face looked pale, without makeup, and the careful confidence she normally wore had disappeared completely. Rainwater dripped from the edge of her umbrella while she struggled to meet my eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Linda glanced past me toward the kitchen where Naomi sat frozen at the table. Her voice trembled slightly when she finally spoke. I came to thank Marcus, she said quietly, and to apologize for things I should have apologized for years ago. Linda stood on my porch looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically smaller, spiritually smaller. Like somebody who had spent years building invisible walls only to wake up trapped inside them alone. The casserole dish trembled slightly in her hands while the wind pushed cold air through the open doorway behind me. For years I had imagined confronting her. I imagined telling her exactly what she had done to my family. The birthday parties Naomi never got invited to. The anonymous complaints. The suspicious glances whenever Marcus walked through the neighborhood after dark wearing his work uniform. But standing there looking at her exhausted face, I realized anger had burned itself out inside me a long time ago. All that remained was tiredness. Marcus is not home yet, I said quietly. Linda nodded too quickly, almost relieved I had given her something practical to focus on. I understand, she whispered. I just thought maybe you could tell him thank you. She held the casserole dish toward me. Awkwardly. I made lasagna. Naomi nearly choked on a laugh behind me before quickly covering her mouth. I could not blame her. Linda Whitmore had spent 11 years acting as though our family lowered the property value of the entire neighborhood. And now she was standing on our porch holding homemade lasagna, like an apology casserole could erase a decade of humiliation. Still, I took the dish carefully because my mother raised me to accept gestures even when they arrived late. Linda hesitated before speaking again. I saw those forum posts this morning, she said softly. People have been sharing screenshots. Her voice cracked on the last word. I did not realize how ugly it all sounded. Naomi looked up sharply from the kitchen table. Teenagers still believe cruelty should shock people once it is spoken aloud. They have not yet learned how often adults disguise ugliness as concern. I studied Linda carefully. You knew exactly how it sounded, I said, not harshly but not gently either. Silence settled between us. Somewhere down the street a chainsaw buzzed as cleanup crews worked on fallen trees. Linda lowered her eyes toward the porch floor. You are right, she admitted quietly. I did. Hearing those words surprised me more than I expected. Most people spend their entire lives protecting themselves from honesty, especially the kind that costs them something. Linda looked toward Naomi then. I owe you an apology too. Naomi crossed her arms tightly, but said nothing. I could feel years of hurt sitting silently beside her at that kitchen table. The whispers at school, the sleepovers she heard about afterward, the parents who smiled politely while steering their children toward other friendships. Linda swallowed hard. Olivia talks about your father all the time, she said to Naomi. She keeps saying he saved her because he is brave. Naomi stared at her for a moment before answering softly. My dad was always brave. People just did not want to see it. Linda looked like the words physically hurt her. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the winter Marcus slipped on ice while carrying groceries, and Linda posted online that he looked suspicious walking around after midnight, even though he had only been coming home from work. I remembered Naomi crying in her bedroom after classmates repeated things their parents said about our family. Some wounds settled deep. Too deep for one apology to reach. Linda took a shaky breath. There is a homeowners association meeting Thursday night, she said quietly. People are demanding answers about those complaints. Naomi frowned slightly. What kind of answers? Linda finally met my eyes again. The kind that should have been told years ago. Thursday evening arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that makes an entire town feel heavy before the sun even disappears. By 6 o'clock, the Cedar Hill Community Center parking lot was already full. Pickup trucks lined the curb beside luxury SUVs while neighbors gathered beneath the fluorescent lights inside, carrying paper coffee cups and nervous expressions. I had attended homeowners association meetings for years, but this was the first time I noticed people avoiding eye contact for reasons that had nothing to do with us. Marcus sat quietly beside me in the second row wearing a navy work jacket with the electric company logo stitched above his chest pocket. Naomi sat on his other side scrolling silently through comments on the rescue video that still continued spreading online. Some local news stations had picked it up by then. Reporters called Marcus a hero. Parents at Naomi's school suddenly smiled at her in the hallways. Even teachers who rarely noticed her before now stopped to ask how her family was doing. Watching it all unfold felt strange. Kindness should not require proof of heroism to exist. Linda Whitmore entered the room almost 10 minutes late, carrying a thick folder against her chest. Conversations softened immediately as she walked toward the front table where the association board sat waiting. I noticed something else too. Nobody rushed to greet her anymore. Nobody complimented her outfit or waved enthusiastically the way they always used to before the fire. People fear public shame almost as much as they fear truth. Mr. Benson, the Homeowners Association president, cleared his throat awkwardly before beginning the meeting. His voice sounded strained beneath the hum of ceiling lights. We are here tonight to discuss concerns regarding discriminatory complaints filed against residents over the past several years. Hearing those words spoken aloud inside that room sent a quiet ripple through the crowd. For years, people used softer language. Misunderstandings, community concerns, neighborhood standards. Nobody wanted to say what it really was. Linda stood slowly before anyone else could speak. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the folder. Most of those complaints came from me, she admitted quietly. The room fell completely silent. I watched several neighbors shift uncomfortably in their seats while others stared down into their laps. Linda swallowed hard before continuing. Not all of them, she added carefully. But enough. Naomi stopped scrolling and looked up sharply beside me. Linda glanced toward our row only briefly before looking away again. When the Carters moved into Cedar Hill, I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood, she said. That is what I called it in my mind. Her voice cracked slightly. But the truth is, I judged them before I ever knew them. Nobody interrupted her. Sometimes silence becomes its own confession. Linda pulled several printed screenshots from the folder and placed them on the front table. Complaints, emails, online posts, some anonymous, some signed openly. One board member looked visibly pale reading through them. I created an environment where people felt comfortable treating that family like outsiders, Linda whispered. And many of you followed my lead. A murmur spread quietly through the room then. Defensive whispers, guilty whispers, the kind people use when they suddenly realize history has witnesses. Marcus remained completely still beside me. That was what amazed me most. My son never looked triumphant, never angry, just tired, deeply tired. Then an older man near the back slowly stood up. Mr. Holloway, I signed some of those complaints too, he admitted softly. Another neighbor raised her hand after him. Then another. The room shifted almost painfully as years of quiet prejudice surfaced one voice at a time beneath the harsh community center lights. Naomi leaned closer toward me and whispered, "They only tell the truth now because everybody saw Dad save that little girl." I looked around the room carefully before answering. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but sometimes people need a moment that forces them to recognize what they were willing to ignore." After the meeting ended, nobody rushed toward the parking lot the way they usually did. People lingered in small, uncomfortable groups beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights, speaking quietly, as though raising their voices might force them to hear themselves too clearly. Marcus stood near the back wall answering questions from a local reporter who had arrived halfway through the meeting after hearing about the online posts. Even then, my son kept his answers short and careful. He never once insulted anyone. Never once listed all the things our family endured over the years. That restraint seemed to unsettle people more than anger would have. Shame grows louder when nobody gives you a fight to hide behind. Naomi and I waited near the coffee station while neighbors approached us one by one. Mrs. Granger apologized for never inviting Naomi to birthday parties with the other girls on the street. Mr. Holloway admitted he used to double-check his car locks whenever Marcus walked past at night, even though my son had never given him a single reason for fear. A younger couple from Maple Drive confessed they stayed quiet during association meetings because they did not want Linda turning against them too. Listening to them all felt strange. Like watching people wake slowly from a dream they should have left years earlier. Naomi accepted every apology politely, but I could tell her heart remained guarded. Children learn quickly when kindness is conditional. On the drive home, she stared silently out the passenger window while rainwater slid across the glass in crooked silver lines beneath the streetlights. "Do you think any of them actually changed?" she finally asked. Marcus kept both hands steady on the steering wheel before answering. "Some probably did," he said quietly. "Some probably just got embarrassed." Naomi looked down at her lap. "How do you tell the difference?" Marcus was silent for several seconds. "Time," he answered softly. "Time always tells the truth about people." That weekend something unusual happened in Cedar Hill. For the first time since we moved there, neighbors started coming toward our house instead of away from it. A teenage boy from 3 houses down knocked on our door Saturday morning, asking if Marcus could teach him how to repair storm-damaged wiring safely. Mrs. Granger dropped off homemade peach cobbler, just because. Even the mail carrier lingered longer than usual talking with me beside the mailbox. The neighborhood had not transformed overnight into some perfect place filled with enlightened people. I was old enough to know life does not work that way. But something important had shifted. The silence surrounding certain behaviors had cracked open. And once people begin saying uncomfortable truths out loud, pretending becomes harder. Sunday afternoon brought another surprise. Naomi walked downstairs wearing jeans and a soft green sweater instead of hiding in her room like she usually did on weekends. "Where are you going?" I asked. She hesitated near the doorway, holding her phone tightly. "Olivia Whitmore invited me to get coffee," she admitted quietly. I blinked in surprise. "You want to go?" Naomi looked uncertain for a moment. "I think she really means it," she said softly. And maybe I am tired of carrying around anger that was never mine to begin with. I watched my granddaughter leave the house that afternoon with nervous shoulders but steady steps. Through the living room window, I saw Olivia waiting near the sidewalk wearing oversized sneakers and clutching 2 paper coffee cups against her chest. The girls smiled awkwardly at each other before walking toward town together beneath the fading autumn sunlight. Something inside me loosened watching them disappear down Sycamore Lane. Not forgiveness exactly. Healing. There is a difference. Forgiveness asks you to erase pain. Healing simply asks you not to let pain define the rest of your life. Later that evening, Marcus stood beside me on the porch while neighborhood lights flickered softly across the street. You know, he said quietly, for years I kept wondering what was wrong with us. I looked at my son carefully. And now, Marcus watched Naomi laughing in the distance as she walked home beside Olivia Whitmore. Now I think the wrongness never belonged to us at all. Winter arrived early that year in Cedar Hill. By mid-November, thin layers of frost covered the lawns each morning and smoke curled gently from chimneys across the neighborhood before sunrise. The streets looked the same on the surface. The same brick houses, the same carefully trimmed hedges, the same holiday wreaths hanging from polished front doors. But underneath, something fundamental had shifted. People had started paying attention to the things they once ignored. At the grocery store, neighbors now greeted Marcus by name instead of offering stiff, uncomfortable nods. At school, Naomi no longer ate lunch alone 3 days a week. Even the homeowners association meetings felt different. Quieter, less performative, as though everyone suddenly understood how dangerous small acts of exclusion can become when repeated long enough. One afternoon, Naomi came home carrying a large white envelope from school. She stood in the kitchen staring at it for nearly 30 seconds before opening it carefully with trembling hands. Marcus looked up from the sink where he had been washing dishes while I folded laundry at the table nearby. What is it? He asked softly. Naomi blinked rapidly as she scanned the letter. Then she laughed. Not the guarded little laugh she used when trying to protect herself from disappointment. A real laugh. Bright and surprised. It is from the state journalism program, she whispered. I got accepted. Marcus dried his hands immediately and crossed the kitchen in 2 quick steps. Accepted where? Naomi looked up at him with tears gathering in her eyes. The mentorship program at Northwestern Prep in Chicago. They only take 20 students every year. For a second, nobody moved. Then Marcus wrapped his arms around his daughter so tightly I thought he might never let go. I turned away, pretending to focus on the towels because some moments deserve privacy even when they overflow your heart. Later that evening, Naomi sat beside me on the porch wrapped in a thick blanket while cold air drifted through the neighborhood, carrying the smell of fireplaces and pine trees. Do you think I would have gotten this before everything happened? She asked quietly. I knew exactly what she meant. Before the fire, before the video, before people finally started seeing her family differently. I considered the question carefully before answering. You earned this because you are talented, I said softly. But maybe you finally stopped shrinking yourself enough for other people to notice. Naomi stared out toward the street for a long moment. I spent years trying to be invisible, she admitted. I thought if I stayed quiet enough, dressed carefully enough, smiled enough, people would feel comfortable around me. Her voice cracked slightly, but they still looked at us like we did not belong. I reached over and squeezed her hand gently. Some people build their comfort on the idea that somebody else should feel smaller, I said. That has nothing to do with your worth. Across the street, Linda Whitmore stepped onto her porch holding a cardboard box. She had changed over the past few weeks in small, noticeable ways. Less makeup, fewer forced smiles, more silence. Rumors had spread quickly through Cedar Hill after the homeowners association meeting. Some neighbors defended her. Others avoided her entirely. Shame isolates people faster than anger ever could. Linda walked slowly across the street and stopped near our front steps. I found these while cleaning my office, she said quietly, handing the box toward Naomi. Inside were old neighborhood event flyers, school fundraiser lists, and holiday invitations from years earlier. Naomi flipped through them silently before realizing something. Her name was missing from nearly every children's activity list. Entire pages had been reprinted without her included. I felt sick looking at them. Evidence of exclusion hidden inside ordinary paperwork. Linda lowered her eyes. I thought if I kept your family outside the circle long enough, eventually everyone would. Stop noticing, she whispered. Naomi stared at the papers for several seconds before closing the box carefully. The worst part, she said softly, is that for a while, I stopped noticing too. By spring, Cedar Hill looked brighter than I remembered. Dogwood trees bloomed along Sycamore Lane, and children rode bicycles through the cul-de-sac until the streetlights flickered on at dusk. Life had settled back into routine on the surface, but beneath it, the neighborhood carried a different kind of awareness now. People greeted each other more carefully. Conversations paused longer before assumptions formed. Even the Homeowners Association newsletter changed. The latest issue featured Naomi's acceptance into the journalism mentorship program on the front page beside a photograph of her smiling in front of the community center. I stared at that picture for a long time when the newsletter arrived in our mailbox. Not because it erased what happened. Nothing could do that. But because for the first time since moving here, my granddaughter looked like somebody who believed she deserved to take up space. Marcus noticed it too. He started laughing more, sleeping better. Sometimes I would catch him standing quietly at the kitchen window in the mornings with coffee in his hands, watching neighbors walk past our house without tension tightening his shoulders. 11 years is a long time to live prepared for rejection. One Saturday afternoon in late April, Cedar Hill held its annual neighborhood block party for the first time since the storm. For years our family attended politely, staying only long enough to avoid appearing unfriendly before returning home early. Nobody said anything openly cruel at those events. That was never the style of Cedar Hill. Exclusion here arrived wrapped in politeness. Empty seats beside you at picnic tables. Conversations that ended when you approached. Smiles that never reached the eyes. But this year felt different the moment we arrived. Mr. Holloway waved Marcus over to help judge the barbecue competition. Mrs. Granger insisted Naomi sit with her grandchildren during the raffle drawings. Even teenagers who once ignored her entirely now greeted her by name. None of it erased the past. Still, watching those small moments unfold felt like watching sunlight slowly reach places that had stayed cold for years. Near sunset, music drifted softly across the neighborhood park while families gathered beneath strings of hanging lights. Children chased each other through the grass, holding melting ice cream cones. I sat alone for a moment near the edge of the pavilion, watching everything quietly when Linda Whitmore approached carrying 2 cups of lemonade. She handed one to me carefully before sitting down beside me, without speaking. For several seconds, we simply watched the neighborhood together. Olivia talks about Naomi constantly now, Linda said softly. She says your granddaughter makes her feel brave. I looked out across the field where the girls stood laughing beside the food tables. They make each other braver, I replied. Linda nodded slowly. Age had softened her somehow these past months. Or maybe honesty had. The hardest thing about confronting who you were is accepting that you cannot become someone better until you stop protecting who you used to be. I spent so many years teaching my daughter to be afraid of people who had done nothing wrong, Linda whispered. I do not think I understood how much damage fear can do until I watched my own child almost lose everything that night. I held the cold lemonade cup between my hands and thought carefully before speaking. Fear only survives when nobody challenges it, I said quietly. That night forced this town to look at itself honestly for the first time. Linda lowered her eyes. Do you think Cedar Hill really changed? She asked. Across the park, Marcus stood near the grill laughing with neighbors while Naomi sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket, helping Olivia braid friendship bracelets from colorful string. The same street that once made us feel unwelcome now looked softer somehow beneath the warm spring lights. Not perfect, just awake. I smiled faintly and looked back toward Linda. I think people finally realized humanity is not something you get to measure by comfort, I said softly. Sometimes it takes one night for a town to understand who was carrying its heart all along.